Vivian slid the train ticket across the breakfast table without looking up from her tea. Colorado, one way. Eleanor picked it up, read it twice. Her stepmother had signed her name on a mail-order bride contract sold her essentially to a rancher she had never met in a territory she had never seen, and done it so cleanly, so efficiently that the ink was already dry before Eleanor knew the pen had moved. Cecilia laughed from the doorway. Actually laughed. Eleanor set the ticket down. She looked at both of them, the woman who had erased her, the girl who found it amusing, and she made a decision so quiet it had no sound at all. She started packing. If this story moves you, we hope you'll subscribe to our channel. Follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end and leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Blackthorne name had meant something in Boston for 3 generations before Eleanor's father married Vivian Aldridge, and the meaning quietly changed. Thomas Blackthorne had been a gentleman, a physician himself, broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, who had raised Eleanor alone after her mother died of fever when Eleanor was 4. He taught her to read medical texts before she was 12. He let her sit beside him when he treated patients in his study, trusting her to hold the lamp steady and to remember what she saw. Eleanor had inherited his hands careful and precise, and his habit of watching people more than talking at them. For 24 years that had been enough. She had her father, his library, and the quiet work of learning. Then Thomas Blackthorne had a heart attack at 57, and Vivian Aldridge became Vivian Blackthorne, and Eleanor's world closed in like a fist. It didn't happen all at once. That was the thing about cruelty. When it came from inside a house, it came in increments, in small doors that closed, and small plates that were somehow always slightly cold by the time they reached her end of the table. Vivian had a daughter, Cecilia, 19, and luminous with the kind of beauty that made men forget to finish their sentences. And Vivian had a plan, though Eleanor did not recognize it as such until the plan was almost complete. Eleanor was 28 years old, unmarried, and by Boston's particular arithmetic, unsalvageable. She had heard the word ugly applied to herself so many times by then that she had almost stopped hearing it. Almost. There was always a moment, a particular turn of phrase, a specific lift of an eyebrow, when it landed fresh and cut exactly as it was intended to. She had strong features, a wide jaw, a nose that her father had called Roman and Cecilia had called unfortunate. She was tall, nearly 5'8", and she carried herself with the erect posture of someone who had learned early that shrinking only encouraged the wrong kind of attention. Her eyes were the color of strong tea, and they missed nothing. But Boston society had made its judgment in the first 5 seconds of every introduction, and Boston society did not revise. What she had, and what no one in Vivian's circle had ever thought to value, was knowledge. She had read every volume in her father's medical library. She had attended 3 years of lectures at Harvard's medical school, slipping in through back arrangements her father had negotiated before his death, sitting in the last row and taking notes in a hand so precise the professors had once argued over whether a woman had actually written them. She knew how to set a bone draw, a fever down stitch, a wound with 7 different knots depending on its depth. She knew the names of plants that would ease pain, and plants that would cause it, and she knew the difference between the two without hesitating. None of that in Vivian's household counted for anything at all. The letter had arrived in February, tucked inside a stack of household correspondence that Vivian managed. Eleanor only saw it because she had been standing at the wrong end of the parlor when Vivian opened it, or perhaps the right end. Vivian read it once, and then a slow, particular smile spread across her face, the smile she wore when she thought she had solved something. "Eleanor," she said, not looking up. "Come here." The letter was from a land agency in Denver. It was advertising mail-order bride arrangements for ranchers in the Colorado Territory, men with established land holdings who were seeking wives of good character and reasonable health. The agency's tone was businesslike, almost clinical. Eleanor read it the way she read everything, completely without expression. "I've taken the liberty," Vivian said, still with that smile, "of responding on your behalf. There's a rancher, a Mr. Callahan. He has agreed to receive you." Eleanor set the letter down on the side table. You signed my name. I am the head of this household. You are not my guardian. I am 28 years old. And unmarried? Vivian folded her hands together in her lap. And unlikely to become married in Boston, Eleanor. We have tried. You are not... She paused with exquisite precision. You are not what Boston men are looking for. Eleanor looked at her stepmother. She kept her face entirely still. And what do you imagine a Colorado rancher is looking for? A worker, Vivian said simply. Which is precisely what you are. Cod. Cecilia found it funny. She did not pretend otherwise. She appeared in the doorway of Eleanor's room that same evening, while Eleanor was sitting at her desk rereading the agency letter she had taken back before Vivian could file it away. Cecilia leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed, already laughing softly. I can't decide if this is genius or horrible, Cecilia said. I know which one it is, Eleanor replied without looking up. Oh, don't be dramatic. It's not as though you have prospects here. Cecilia came into the room uninvited as she always did and sat on the edge of Eleanor's bed. At least in Colorado no one knows about you. You could invent yourself entirely. I'm not a fiction. No? Cecilia tilted her head and studied her the way she might study a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the room. But you're also not exactly a drawing room ornament, are you? You're wasted here, Eleanor. Genuinely. All those books and you spend your days managing household accounts. Eleanor turned in her chair. Are you trying to make me feel better about being sold? Cecilia's smile didn't waver. I'm trying to tell you that you might as well go. Because you want me gone. A beat of silence. Then Cecilia shrugged one shoulder, and in that shrug was every honest thing she'd never said out loud. Yes, because I want your room, your absence, your father's remaining goodwill redirected entirely toward me. Yes, because you make Mother uncomfortable just by existing with that steady, unimpressed stare of yours. Yes, because you were here first, and we have never forgiven you for it. The ticket is already purchased, Cecilia said. You leave Thursday. Eleanor did not cry that night. She had made a habit years ago of saving her tears for things that could be changed. Instead, she went to her father's study. Still her father's study. Though Vivian had replaced the curtains with something plum-colored and wrong, and she took 4 books from the medical shelf. Gray's Anatomy, a Pharmacopoeia, a surgical guide published in 1869, and her father's personal notes handwritten in a leather journal recording 20 years of cases, treatments, and observations. She packed them in the bottom of her suitcase beneath her winter dresses and her woolen stockings, and the single good pair of gloves she owned. She packed her father's stethoscope last. She wrapped it in a cotton handkerchief and placed it at the very top of the bag where she could reach it first if she needed to. Then she sat on her bed in the quiet of the room and she told herself the thing she had been telling herself since she was 4 years old, and her mother was gone, and her father was weeping in the next room, and the world had revealed itself as a place that did not arrange itself kindly for everyone. You are still here. That is sufficient for now. The train from Boston to Chicago was 31 hours. Chicago to Denver was another 26. Eleanor spent most of the first leg reading. She had learned a long time ago that books were the most effective portable shelter ever invented. Open one, and you were somewhere else entirely unreachable to people who wanted to remind you of your deficiencies. She read straight through Ohio and into Indiana, stopping only when the car lurched and her page lost its place. The woman across the aisle had been watching her for 2 hours before she finally spoke. You read like you're hungry, the woman said. Eleanor looked up. The woman was perhaps 60, broad-faced and cheerful, with a traveling hat slightly too large for her head. Her name, Eleanor would learn, was Mrs. Addie Sorrells, and she was returning to Denver after visiting her sister in Providence. I am hungry, Eleanor said. I always am. Mrs. Sorrells looked at the stack of books beside Eleanor's knee. She pointed at the one on top, the surgical guide. You a nurse? No. Eleanor paused. My father was a physician. I learned from him. You practice yourself? Not formally. Women aren't permitted formally." Mrs. Sorrells made a sound that communicated exactly what she thought of that particular arrangement. "Where are you headed?" Eleanor hesitated for only a moment. "Red Hollow, Colorado." The older woman's expression shifted, not alarm exactly, but something adjacent to it. A recognition. "That's rough country. You have family there." "No." Eleanor folded her hands over her book. "I am to be married. A ranching arrangement." Mrs. Sorrells was quiet for long enough that Eleanor could hear the wheels on the track, the steady rhythmic percussion of the train eating up distance. Then the older woman said carefully, "And you chose this?" Eleanor looked at her. She thought about Cecilia's laugh. She thought about the ticket tucked into her coat pocket, already paid for, already decided. She thought about her father's stethoscope wrapped in a handkerchief at the top of her bag. "I'm choosing it now," she said. "That's close enough." Mrs. Sorrells moved to the empty seat beside Eleanor somewhere in Illinois, and they talked for 6 hours. It was the most Eleanor had talked to anyone in months. "Addie Sorrells. Call me Addie, for heaven's sake. Mrs. Sorrells is my mother-in-law, and she was a tyrant, had lived in Denver for 11 years, and knew the territory, the way you only knew a place that had once tried to kill you and failed." She talked about the winters, the altitude, the particular silence of the high plains at dusk that you either fell in love with or couldn't survive. "And Red Hollow?" Eleanor asked. "Small," Addie said. "Maybe 60 families spread across 20 miles of valley. Good soil, bad winters. The Callahan Ranch is the biggest operation in the area. 300 head of cattle last I heard. Maybe more." She looked sideways at Eleanor. "You know Rhett Callahan?" "I know his name. The agency provided a letter." "What did he say in it?" Eleanor opened her satchel and withdrew the single-folded page she had received 3 weeks ago, forwarded from the agency, with a note from Vivian that said, "Only your reply has been sent. The arrangements are confirmed." She had not been permitted to respond herself. She had read Rhett Callahan's letter 40 times on the train already. She handed it to Addie. It was short, 8 sentences, written in a straight, economical hand. "Miss Blackthorne, I am a rancher of 34 years, widowed 3 years past. I run 340 head and 12 hired men. My needs are practical and my expectations are fair. I am told you are capable and willing to work. I will meet you at the Red Hollow station on March 14th. If, when you see the situation, you wish to return east, I will pay your passage back without argument. I ask only that you be honest with me from the start. I will offer you the same. R. Callahan." Addie read it again. Then she folded it carefully and handed it back. "Well," she said, "he's not a poet." "No. But he said he'd pay your way back." Addie looked at her. "That matters. That tells you something." Eleanor tucked the letter back into her satchel. "It tells me he has enough money that sending me home wouldn't hurt him." "It tells you," Addie said firmly, "that he's not planning to trap you." Eleanor said nothing. She looked out the dark window at the flat black of the Midwestern night passing by. She was thinking about the phrase "honest from the start" and what it would feel like to be in a room with a person who meant it. She couldn't quite picture it, but she held on to it anyway. Denver appeared at dawn on the 3rd day, the Rockies rising behind it like something out of a fever dream, enormous and white-tipped, and utterly indifferent to the small train pulling into the station beneath them. Addie squeezed her hand before they parted. "Write to me," the older woman said. She pressed a card into Eleanor's palm with her Denver address on it. "And Eleanor?" She waited until Eleanor met her eyes. "Don't let them make you small out here. The frontier has no patience for small. You be exactly as much as you are." Eleanor held the card tight. "Thank you," she said. It came out rougher than she intended, because she had not expected kindness, and had not braced herself against it. The stage from Denver to Red Hollow took 4 more hours, and Eleanor spent most of it alone. The coach had 2 other passengers, a fur trader who slept through most of it, and a young man delivering mail who spent the ride studying Eleanor with the open, unguarded curiosity of someone who had simply never seen a woman with a stack of medical books. He asked her about them once. She explained. He nodded slowly as though assembling a puzzle. "Red Hollow's got no doctor," he said finally. "Not since old Perkins died in November." Eleanor looked at him. "What do people do?" He shrugged. "Pray mostly. Ride 3 hours to Glenville if they can make it." She absorbed that without expression, filed it, moved on. The valley came into view an hour from town, long and pale and winter bare. The grass flattened under 2 weeks of frost, the mountains pressing in close on 3 sides. It was nothing like Boston, nothing like anything she had seen. It had a scale to it that was almost offensive in its boldness, as though the land had never had to apologize for taking up space. Eleanor found to her own surprise that she did not hate it. The Red Hollow station was a single wooden platform and a building not much larger than her Boston bedroom. She was the only passenger who stepped down. She stood on the platform with her suitcase at her feet and her good wool coat and her father's stethoscope in her bag, and she looked at the small scatter of buildings that constituted Red Hollow, Colorado, and she breathed. The air was cold. Sharper than Boston cold, a different quality to it, thin and clean, and absolutely without mercy. It went straight into the lungs like a correction. She heard boots on the platform before she saw him. Rhett Callahan was not what she had imagined. She wasn't sure what she had imagined, something rougher, perhaps something more immediately difficult to look at. He was tall, about 6'1", with the particular build of a man who worked with his body every day, not for vanity, but because the work required it. His coat was plain dark wool. His hat was pushed back slightly on his head. He had a beard neat enough to be intentional, and dark eyes that went directly to her face and stayed there without the flicker of assessment she had braced herself for that swift, damning inventory she had endured at every Boston dinner party for the last decade. He stopped 4 feet from her. He said, "Miss Blackthorne." Not a question. Not a greeting exactly. Just her name spoken as though confirming an appointment. "Mr. Callahan," she said. They looked at each other across 4 feet of Colorado air. Eleanor kept her spine straight, and her hands still, and her face exactly neutral. She had dressed deliberately that morning, not to impress, but to be clearly herself. No artifice. No softening of angles that were simply her angles. Rhett Callahan looked at her the way she imagined he looked at weather, carefully, and without drama, trying to understand what it was actually going to do. Then he said, "Long ride." "3 days," she said. "You hungry?" "Yes." He picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it, not with ceremony, with the efficient practicality of a man who noticed what needed doing, and did it. He said, "There's a decent meal at the boarding house. We can talk there." She fell into step beside him. The platform boards were uneven, and she adjusted without comment. "Your letter said you'd pay my passage home if I wished to return," she said. He glanced sideways at her. "I meant it." "I know. I want to understand the terms before I sit down to eat, if you don't mind. I find it easier to think when the practical questions are settled." He stopped walking. He turned and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not displeasure, not surprise, something closer to attention. As if he had recalibrated something. "All right," he said. "Ask." Eleanor squared herself to face him on the main street of Red Hollow, with the wind pulling at her coat, and people she didn't know moving around them on all sides. "How did the agency describe me to you?" she asked. "A beat. Capable, educated, available. Did they tell you I was considered unsuitable in Boston?" "They said you were unmarried at 28. That's the polite version." She held his gaze. "Did they send a portrait?" "No. My stepmother arranged this without my knowledge or consent. I signed nothing. I came because I had the choice of leaving or staying in a house where I was unwanted, and this at least offered the possibility of usefulness." She paused. "I am not delicate. I am not decorative. I have no intention of pretending otherwise. If those are the terms, I can stay. If you expected something else, I would rather know now, while the stage can still turn around." Rhett Callahan was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said, "I didn't ask for decorative. My wife was decorative." He said it without bitterness, but with the particular flatness of a man who had learned something the hard way. She lasted 14 months. The winters killed her spirit before the third one got her lungs. He shifted her suitcase to his other hand. "I asked for capable." "Then we may be able to work with each other," Eleanor said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "Come eat," he said. "Then I'll show you the ranch." The boarding house was run by a woman named May Garrett, who was 52, enormous in personality, if not in stature, and who had apparently heard about Eleanor's arrival before Eleanor had even stepped off the stage, because she appeared in the doorway the moment they pushed through the door and said immediately, "You're the Boston woman." "Eleanor Blackthorne," Eleanor said and extended her hand. May shook it with both of hers, studying Eleanor the way Addie Sorrells had, not unkindly, but openly. Measuring. "Rhett tells me you have medical training," May said. Eleanor shot a look at Rhett. "I rode ahead," he said simply. "May's the closest thing Red Hollow has to a nurse." Has, May corrected, until now apparently. She was already steering Eleanor toward a table. Sit. I'll bring soup. Rhett, go stable the horse, you're letting cold air in." Rhett went. May returned with a soup that was primarily turnip and salt pork, and was, Eleanor thought, one of the finest things she had ever tasted after 3 days of train food. May sat across from her and talked while Eleanor ate. "Doc Perkins died November 16th, she said. "Stroke. He was 71 and had no business still practicing, but we had no one else. Since then, we've had 2 broken arms, a case of childbed fever that almost took Hattie Dunn, and a baby delivered by her husband with a pocket knife and a prayer." May's eyes were steady and serious above her practical face. "You really know medicine." "I know what my father taught me," Eleanor said carefully, "and what I taught myself. I am not licensed because women are not licensed. But I have practical knowledge, and I am willing to use it." "Good enough for me," May said instantly. "The law may not agree. The law is 3 hours away." May waved one hand. "And it has never once delivered a baby in the middle of a blizzard." Eleanor looked at her over the edge of her bowl. "Has that happened?" Eleanor asked. "Oh, it'll happen," May said. "Winter's not half done." Rhett returned in time for the second round of coffee, and sat across the table from Eleanor, with his hat on the chair beside him and his big hands wrapped around a tin cup. "I want to be clear about something," he said. Eleanor set down her coffee. "Go ahead. What I put in that letter, I meant it. You're not trapped here. The arrangement is a framework. If it doesn't work, we don't have to proceed." He met her eyes steadily. "But if you stay, I need someone who works. The ranch runs on work. Every person on the property works, myself included. There's no room for ceremony." "I understand that." "Do you—" He wasn't challenging her. He was asking the actual question. "Boston's different. I've been told Boston is very different. I grew up in a physician's household," Eleanor said. "I have cleaned wounds and held instruments and been in the room when people died. I have managed household accounts for a family of 4 since I was 19. I can read, write, calculate, and ride, though the riding is approximate." She paused. "Boston has drawing rooms. I have spent very little of my life in them." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. "Can you actually ride?" he said. "I said approximate." "How approximate?" "I can stay on a horse that is not actively trying to remove me." He absorbed this. "We'll work on it." It was such a simple, practical response, no mockery, no dramatic proclamation, that Eleanor felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Some arrangement of bracing that she had been holding since Boston, since the train ticket, since the sound of Cecilia's laughter. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding it. "There's one more thing," she said. "Go ahead. I have medical books, and my father's notes. If there are patients in Red Hollow who need treatment, I intend to treat them with or without formal arrangement. I'm telling you this not as a request, but as a statement of what I will do." Rhett wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "May already told me about the childbed fever," he said. "Then you understand." "I understand." He nodded once. "I won't stop you. I'll help where I can." He stood reaching for his hat. "Ready to see the ranch?" Eleanor stood. "Yes," she said. Outside, the mountains were blazing white in the afternoon sun, and Red Hollow spread itself before her, small and rough and serious, and absolutely nothing like anything she had left behind. Eleanor Blackthorne picked up her suitcase. She walked forward. The ranch hands were lined up by the fence when they arrived, with the particular studied casualness of men who are absolutely staring while pretending not to. There were 7 of them, visible, a mix of ages, from perhaps 18 to 60, in various states of work-interrupted attention. They watched Eleanor climb down from Rhett's wagon with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to outright skepticism. The tallest one, a raw-boned man of about 40 with red hair, going to gray spat tobacco, and said to no one in particular, "Huh. That's Hector Vane," Rhett said quietly, for Eleanor's ears only. "Foreman. Been with me 9 years. Opinion of him matters." "Does he form opinions quickly?" Eleanor said. "Not favorable ones." Eleanor walked directly to Hector Vane. He straightened slightly as she approached, purely from reflex, something in the directness of her stride catching him off guard. "Mr. Vane," she said, and offered her hand. He looked at it for a half-second too long before he shook it. His grip was deliberately firm. Hers matched it. "Miss Blackthorne," he said, like he was testing the sound of it. "I'm told Doc Perkins died in November," she said. "I'm also told there have been injuries and illness since then, with no one to properly address them. I intend to set up a basic treatment station in whatever space Mr. Callahan makes available. If any of your men are carrying untreated injuries, and in my experience, men always are, I'd appreciate knowing about them sooner rather than later." Hector stared at her. Behind him, one of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 20, with a splinted-looking wrist wrapped in old cloth, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Eleanor looked past Hector directly at the young man. "What happened to your wrist?" The boy blinked. "Caught it in a fence post, ma'am, 3 weeks back." 3 weeks. She kept her face neutral. "Is it set?" May looked at it. "Is it set?" She asked again, to May's absence, to no one, to the general principal. The boy looked at Hector. Hector looked at Eleanor. There was a brief, silent negotiation. "Probably not right," the boy admitted. "Come see me this evening," Eleanor said, "after supper." She turned back to Hector Vane. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized from every room she'd ever walked into the recalibration. The slight adjustment of a prior assessment in the face of data that didn't fit the original conclusion. She did not smile. She didn't need to. "Mr. Vane," she said, "I'm not here to be decorative or to cause difficulty. I'm here to be useful. I expect we'll work well together once we understand each other." He worked the tobacco to the other side of his cheek. He glanced at Rhett, who had stood back and watched the entire exchange without intervening. Then Hector Vane said slowly, "You ride approximately," Eleanor said. Something not quite a smile, but the structural ancestor of one crossed his weathered face. "We'll see about that," he said. Kink. That night, after the young hand's wrist was properly reset, the boy had gone white around the mouth but had not made a sound, and when she was done, he'd looked at his arm as if it belonged to someone better cared for than himself. Eleanor sat at the small desk in the corner of the room Rhett had given her. She opened her father's notebook to the first blank page. She wrote the date. March 14th, 1875. Red Hollow, Colorado. She wrote one sentence below it. Patient Thomas Garrett, age 20. Right radius previously improperly set. Corrected. Then she stopped, and she looked at what she'd written, and she let herself acknowledge the thing she hadn't been able to look at directly since Boston. She was terrified. Not of the frontier, not of the work, not of Rhett Callahan, who had turned out to be the single most straightforward person she had encountered in years. She was terrified of wanting this. of having arrived somewhere that against every expectation and every reasonable calculation felt like a place she might actually be allowed to be herself, and then losing it. She had been removed once by people who held power over her life. It could happen again. She had no legal standing here, no formal arrangement completed. Vivian was still in Boston with Eleanor's father's estate partially in her control, and Vivian had made very clear that she considered Eleanor a problem to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. Eleanor closed the notebook. She thought about what Addie Sorrells had said on the train. Don't let them make you small. She looked out the dark window at the mountains she couldn't see but knew were there. All right, she said aloud to herself, to the room, to whatever had brought her here, whether it was cruelty or accident or something stranger than either. All right, let's see what this turns into. She opened the notebook again, and she kept writing until the candle ran low, recording everything she had seen and learned on this first day of a life she had not chosen, but was with increasing deliberateness beginning to claim. Thomas Garrett's wrist healed clean. Eleanor knew it before he said anything. She could tell by the way he used it, not guardedly, not with the unconscious compensation of a man protecting an injury, but freely, the way you use a hand you trust again. He was stacking feed sacks 3 days after she'd reset it, and when he caught her watching, he held the wrist up and flexed it twice like proof. She nodded once, went back to what she was doing. But word moves fast in a small place, faster than Eleanor had calculated. By the end of that first week, 2 more ranch hands had come to find her, one with a shoulder that had been dislocated and reset badly sometime the previous fall, the other with an infected cut along his forearm that had been wrapped in a strip of flour sack for God knows how long and was beginning to smell like trouble. She cleaned the arm debrided. It applied a proper poultice and told the man whose name was Curtis, a barrel-chested Texan of about 35, that if he'd waited another week, he might have lost it. Curtis looked at his arm with the particular expression of a man who has just narrowly avoided a disaster he didn't know he was in. May looked at it, he said by way of explanation. May is not a physician. Neither are you, he said, but without edge. More like he was stating a fact he was still sorting out the implications of. No? Eleanor agreed. But I'm what you have. He didn't argue that. He came back 2 days later so she could check the wound, and he brought a second man with him, one who had a molar that needed extracting and had been managing it with whiskey for 3 weeks. Eleanor had never pulled a tooth in a formal setting. She had, however, read the relevant chapters of her father's surgical guide twice through on the train, and once more the previous night, and she had the forceps her father had left her along with everything else. She pulled the tooth. The man did not pass out, which she considered a collective achievement. By the end of the second week, Hector Vane stopped treating her like furniture he was deciding whether to move. It happened on a Tuesday, which was, as far as Eleanor could tell, the day Red Hollow used for its disasters. She was in the small room off the main house that Rhett had cleared for her. She'd begun calling it the treatment room in her notes, though it contained at this point only a table, 2 chairs, and the equipment she'd carried from Boston when she heard the commotion outside. Raised voices. The particular urgency of men who are trying to sound calm and failing. She was out the door before anyone came to find her. The situation was Hector Vane's youngest hand, a 16-year-old named Pip, who had no business being 16 and working a cattle ranch, but was doing it anyway, who had caught his leg between a fence post and a panicked steer and had something wrong with the knee that was becoming obvious even from 15 feet away. Eleanor pushed through the ring of men without asking permission. She knelt beside Pip on the cold ground. He was white-faced and trying not to make sounds he considered unmanly, which meant he was making small controlled sounds through his teeth every few seconds. "Stop that," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "Making noise doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're in pain, which you obviously are." Pip blinked at her. Then, as if granted permission he hadn't expected, he exhaled hard through his teeth and said, "It hurts real bad, ma'am." "I know. Let me see." She examined the knee with her hands, methodical and sure, cataloging what she felt against what she knew. Not broken, the bone was intact. But the ligament damage was significant, and the swelling was coming up fast. She needed cold elevation, a proper brace. "He needs to be moved inside," she said, standing. "Carefully. 2 people, one at the shoulder, one supporting the leg, keep it straight. Don't let it rotate." Nobody moved for exactly 1 second, that second of masculine hesitation of waiting to see who was in charge here. Hector Vane said, "You heard her. Curtis Alderman, get him up." Eleanor registered that, filed it. They moved Pip inside, and Eleanor worked on the knee for 40 minutes, while Hector stood in the doorway, with his hat in his hands, not watching exactly, but not leaving either. When she'd finished the brace improvised from 2 pieces of flat wood and strips of clean cloth, and had Pip elevated with a cold compress, she turned and found Hector looking at her with an expression that was different from anything she'd seen on his face before. Not admiration. Something more complicated than that. A reordering. "He'll need to stay off it 3 weeks minimum," she said. "The ligament is torn, not severed. It can heal if he doesn't stress it." Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Doc Perkins would have told him to walk it off." "Doc Perkins was wrong about a number of things, I expect." That almost pulled a laugh out of him. He suppressed it, but she saw it. "I owe you an apology," he said. Eleanor raised her eyebrows. "When you arrived," he said, "I made a judgment." "You made the only judgment you had available at the time," Eleanor said. "You had no information. I'd have done the same." He looked at her steadily. "You're not what I expected." "No," she agreed. "I find that's generally true." Rhett saw it happen. He'd been at the edge of the yard when they carried Pip in, and he'd watched Eleanor take charge of the situation with the focused efficiency of a woman who had prepared for exactly this, and hadn't needed to think twice about it. That evening, he came to find her while she was writing her notes. He didn't knock. The door was open. He stood in the frame and said, "Hector came to see me." Eleanor kept writing. "Did he?" "He said you were direct." "I am." "He said you were also right about the knee." "I was." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Eleanor finished her sentence, set down her pen, and turned in her chair to face him. "Is this a conversation?" she asked. "Or a report?" Something moved in his eyes. That thing she'd started to recognize, the slight involuntary response when she said something he hadn't anticipated. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "The room you're using. It's too small." Eleanor waited. "There's a larger space at the east end of the house. Used to be a storeroom. Better light, bigger table. I can have the men clear it by end of week." He paused. "If you want it." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Callahan," she said carefully, "are you offering me a clinic?" "I'm offering you a better room," he said. "What you call it is your business." She turned back to her desk and picked up her pen. "End of week," she said. "Yes, thank you." She heard him leave. She heard his boots on the floor, the quiet close of the outer door. She sat for a moment with her pen not moving. No one had ever offered her more space before. Every house she'd lived in, every room, every position she'd occupied, had been about making herself fit into the space allotted. No one had looked at what she was doing and thought she needs more room than this. Let's give it to her. She had to sit with that for a minute before she could go back to writing. May Garrett appeared on Thursday with a patient Eleanor hadn't expected. The woman's name was Ruth Alderman, wife of the ranch hand Curtis. It turned out, and she had been managing a cough for 6 weeks that had recently become something more serious. She was 41, thin in the way of someone who worked constantly and ate last with the particular combination of stubborn and frightened that Eleanor had learned to recognize in women who had put off seeking care for too long because asking for help felt like an admission of weakness. Eleanor examined her carefully. She listened to her lungs 3 times. What she heard was not what she'd hoped to hear. "Mrs. Alderman," she said, setting the stethoscope down, "I need you to be honest with me." Ruth looked at her steadily. "I'm listening." "How long have you had night sweats?" A pause. "Couple months." "Weight loss?" Ruth looked at her hands. Some. Eleanor kept her voice level and her face clear of the alarm that was moving through her. I need to tell you what I'm hearing, and I need you to hear it clearly so we can work with it honestly. All right? Ruth's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Eleanor told her. She told her what the sounds in the lungs might indicate. She told her the word tuberculosis directly without softening it into uselessness, because Ruth Alderman was a woman who handled cattle and blizzards, and she deserved the real information. She told her what could be done, what the limitations were, what the outcomes might look like depending on how far advanced it was. Ruth was quiet for a very long moment. Then she said, Curtis can't know yet. He should know. He'll worry himself sick. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. Let me decide how to tell him. Just let me be the one to decide. Eleanor thought about this. She thought about a woman's right to manage the information about her own body in her own time. 2 weeks, Eleanor said. If you haven't told him in 2 weeks, I'll have to. Not to override you because he needs to be taking care around you. He needs to know to let you rest when you need it. Ruth nodded. Then she looked at Eleanor with something direct and raw. Are you going to be all right? Knowing and not saying. Eleanor met her eyes. I have kept harder things than this. She had. She had kept her own dignity in a house that tried to strip it. She had kept her father's reputation intact after his death when Vivian attempted to revise his legacy. She had kept herself together on a 3-day train ride into the complete unknown. A secret entrusted by a frightened woman was nothing she couldn't carry. But there was another problem arriving, and it wore better clothes than any of them. His name was Gerald Pratt, and he arrived in Red Hollow on a Wednesday afternoon with a letter from a Boston law firm and the particular energy of a man who had been sent to accomplish something unpleasant and was trying to make it seem routine. Eleanor was in the East Room, the new space just cleared and still smelling of old grain sacks, when May came to find her with the news. There's a man at the boarding house asking after you, May said. Lawyer type. Got a letter with your family name on it. Eleanor's hands went still on the instrument she was cleaning. Did he give his name? Gerald Pratt. Says he represents Vivian Blackthorne's household interests. The familiar cold moved through her, not panic, but the thing just adjacent to it, the recognition of a pattern she knew. This was how Vivian operated. Not in the open, never in the open. She sent representatives. Eleanor set down the instrument. She straightened her back and her cuffs. Where is Mr. Callahan? She asked. Out with the cattle, back by supper. Then I'll go alone, Eleanor said. May caught her arm. Eleanor, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Eleanor said. The longer I wait, the more authority he assumes. She walked to the boarding house. Gerald Pratt was about 50, with an expensive coat and the kind of self-assurance that comes from decades of dealing with people who couldn't afford to make him uncomfortable. He stood when she entered, a reflex of courtesy over condescension, and regarded her with the mild professional interest of a man who was about to execute a disagreeable task. Miss Blackthorne, he said. Mr. Pratt? She sat down across from him without being invited to. She put her hands flat on the table. I assume you've come on behalf of my stepmother. On behalf of the Blackthorne estate, yes. He opened his leather case with practiced efficiency. I have here a document pertaining to certain financial arrangements made prior to your departure from Boston. As you may be aware, your late father's estate includes a trust provision for any unmarried daughter of Thomas Blackthorne. Mrs. Blackthorne, your stepmother has filed a petition to have that provision reviewed on the grounds that your current— He paused with great delicacy. Arrangement in Colorado constitutes a voluntary abandonment of your legal domicile and family responsibilities. Eleanor looked at him. She let the silence sit for a moment. She's trying to dissolve the trust, Eleanor said. She is contesting the terms of Mr. Pratt? Eleanor kept her voice entirely measured. I have been practicing medicine in this settlement for 2 weeks. I have treated 6 patients, including a ligament injury, an infected wound, an abscessed tooth, and a potentially serious respiratory condition. I did not abandon my family. My family mailed me west on a one-way ticket. She leaned forward slightly. Are you prepared to defend in a Colorado court the proposition that a woman exercising a professional skill in a frontier settlement has abandoned her responsibilities? Pratt blinked. It was a very small blink, but it was real. The petition is filed in Boston, he said, not in Colorado. Then it will have to remain in Boston, Eleanor said. Because I am not in Boston. I am here, and I intend to remain here. Miss Blackthorne. He recovered smoothly, the professional composure reassembling itself. You have no legal representation. You have no formal standing in Colorado. You are not a licensed physician. Your position here is— My position here, Eleanor said quietly, is that of a woman who has done more good in 2 weeks than your client has done in 3 years of managing an estate that isn't hers. She stood. Tell Mrs. Blackthorne that I received her message. Tell her that I will be retaining counsel. And tell her that the trust provision my father wrote is something he thought about carefully and deliberately, which was his habit in everything, and that I intend to honor his intentions even if she does not. She walked to the door. Then she stopped because she was her father's daughter, and her father never left a room without the last necessary thing. Mr. Pratt, she said without turning. How is Cecilia? A pause. She is well. Tell her I said hello. She let a beat pass. And tell her she has my room now. I hope it suits her. She walked out. Hug. She was 3 steps from the boarding house door when Rhett came around the corner from the livery, still dusty from the cattle work, and read her face in one look. What happened, he said. Not a question. Eleanor stopped. She had been holding herself together on pure structure for the last 20 minutes, the way you hold a broken thing in your hands by being very still and very careful about pressure. Rhett's directness, that simple what happened with no preamble and no performance, was precisely the wrong thing for her careful stillness. She felt something shift in her chest. My stepmother, she said. She's filing a petition in Boston to dissolve the trust my father left me. She sent a lawyer. Rhett's jaw tightened. How much trouble is that? Enough. I have no legal representation. I have no formal claim in this territory yet. She paused. And she knows that. What do you need? Eleanor looked at him. There it was again, that simple, practical question. Not, I'm sorry. Not that's terrible. Not the social performance of sympathy that left you feeling observed rather than helped. Just what do you need? A lawyer, she said. Or something that functions as one. There's a man in Glenville, Rhett said immediately. Ambrose Vale. He's a proper attorney. Did work on my land title 4 years ago. I'll write him tonight. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. His voice wasn't impatient, just clear. Eleanor, I wrote you a letter that said I'd be honest with you. I meant it. What I didn't write because it seemed presumptuous at the time is that if you stay on this ranch, you're part of what I protect. That's just how it works. The word protect sat differently than she'd expected, not like property, not like charity, like a statement of position, the way a man stands between his land and a storm, not because the land can't survive the storm, but because standing there is what he does. Eleanor straightened. I'd like to write the letter myself if you'll give me Vale's address. Rhett almost smiled. Thought you might. I'll tell you what I write. I didn't ask. I'm telling you anyway. He nodded once. Fair enough. The next 2 weeks had a rhythm to them, not comfortable exactly, but functional, which Eleanor was beginning to understand was the frontier's version of comfortable. She treated patients every morning in the East Room, which May had quietly helped her furnish with items donated from various households. A proper examining table, fashioned from 2 sawhorses and a solid plank curtains, that at least made the room feel less like a storeroom. A set of glass jars for the medications and poultices she was mixing from her father's pharmacopoeia. In the afternoons, she rode. It had been Hector's idea officially, though Eleanor suspected Rhett had suggested it. You can't be useful out here if you can't move out here, Hector had said with his customary lack of ceremony. And you need a horse that fits you, not the sorriest animal in the stable. He gave her a gray mare named Abigail, who was steady and opinionated and who had evidently thrown 2 ranch hands in the past year and was therefore considered the appropriate challenge for Eleanor. Eleanor and Abigail regarded each other with mutual wariness for about 15 minutes the first day. Then Eleanor fed her 3 of the dried apple slices she'd brought from May's kitchen, and Abigail made a decision, and that was largely that. "She likes you," said the youngest hand watching over the fence. "She likes the apples," Eleanor said. Same thing with Abigail. Within a week, Eleanor was riding well enough that Hector stopped cringing. Within 2, she was riding well enough to go out to the eastern pasture and back without an escort, which she did twice, carrying her bag because 2 of the families at the far end of the valley had children she'd heard needed checking on, and the distance had been keeping them from coming to her. One of those children had a fever. She caught it early. She sat at the family's table and drank the coffee they offered her, and told the mother, a woman named Lenora Graves, what to watch for and when to worry. Lenora Graves looked at Eleanor with the particular expression of a woman who has been scared and is now very cautiously not scared anymore. "The other doctor," Lenora said. "Perkins. He wouldn't come out this far." "I'll come," Eleanor said. "It's an hour's ride. I know where it is." Lenora reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Eleanor's. It lasted only a second, but it was the kind of touch that carries weight, the weight of gratitude that has been waiting somewhere with nowhere to go. Eleanor rode home in the cold and thought about what it meant to be needed in a place. Really needed. Not needed the way the Blackthorne household had needed someone to manage the accounts and be invisible the rest of the time, but needed the way that person might be the difference between a child who makes it through a fever and one who doesn't. She had not known this feeling before. It was enormous and terrifying, and she wanted it with a ferocity that surprised her. The letter from Ambrose Vale arrived at the end of the 3rd week. It was addressed to Eleanor directly. She had written to him directly, without routing it through Rhett. And Vale had replied in kind, which told her something useful about his character. He had reviewed the situation. He was frank. The Boston petition was real and would take time to contest, but it had significant weaknesses. Vivian had signed Eleanor's name on the original mail-order correspondence without consent, which constituted a forgery under Massachusetts law. The trust provision, as her father had written it, was specifically conditioned on Eleanor's voluntary renunciation of her claim, which she had not provided. And Eleanor's current situation in Colorado, she had been careful to detail it exactly, was sufficiently established to constitute a legal domicile under territorial law. In short, Vale wrote in a spare direct hand she immediately respected, "Your stepmother has overplayed her hand. She assumed you would not fight. You should fight. I am willing to take the matter." Eleanor sat with that letter for a long time. She fought the urge to feel triumphant. Triumph was premature, but she let herself feel for one careful minute the specific satisfaction of having been underestimated by someone who should have known better. Vivienne had looked at her and seen a woman who would absorb whatever was done to her. A woman with no resources, no allies, no standing. She had not looked carefully enough. Eleanor folded the letter. She went to find Rhett. He was at the fence line doing something with a post that had come loose. He heard her coming and looked up, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down his tools. "Good news," he said. "Possible good news." She handed him the letter. "Read it." He read it. She watched his face while he did the slight controlled shift of his expression as he understood what Vale was saying. When he looked up, there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen aimed at her before. Not just the practical respect he'd been offering since the first day. Something warmer and more specific than that. "You wrote him yourself," Rhett said. "You gave me the address. You didn't ask me to write on your behalf." "No," Eleanor said. "It's my fight." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back down at the letter, and something shifted very slightly in his face that controlled minimal expression of a man who has just had to reassess what he's feeling and is being careful about what he does with it. "All right," he said. He folded the letter and handed it back to her. "What do you need from me?" "At some point," Eleanor said carefully, "the petition may require documentation of my situation here, what I'm doing, Who I am in this community." She paused. "Your account of it will carry weight." "You'll have it," he said without hesitation. Eleanor nodded. She turned to go. Then she stopped because she had learned something from him about the usefulness of the last necessary thing. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Rhett," he said for the first time. She turned. He was already picking up his tools again, back to the fence post, as if the correction were nothing consequential. "Rhett," she said. He glanced up. "Thank you," she said. "For the room, for the lawyer, for—" She stopped because the list was becoming longer than she'd planned, and she wasn't ready for him to see the length of it. "For not being what I was afraid of." Rhett held her gaze for a moment. "You weren't what I expected either," he said. He went back to the fence post. She went back to her patience. The wind came off the mountains cold and steady, the way it always did this time of day, the way she was already starting to recognize. Red Hollow was beginning to feel, with terrifying and specific certainty, like somewhere she belonged. She was not going to let anyone take that from her. Not Vivian, not Gerald Pratt, not Boston, not anything. She went inside, and she kept working. The blizzard announced itself, the way the worst things always do quietly, and then all at once. Eleanor had been watching the sky change for 2 days. She said nothing because she was still new enough to Red Hollow that she chose her warnings carefully, saving them for the moments when she was certain. But on the morning of the 3rd day, she came into the kitchen where Rhett was drinking his first coffee, and she said without preamble, "It's coming tonight." Rhett looked at her over his cup. "Hector said tomorrow." "Hector is wrong." A pause. Not a challenging pause, a considering one. "How sure are you?" he said. "My father used to say that a sky that color in the afternoon means snow by midnight." She poured her own coffee. "He was right every time I saw him say it." Rhett set down his cup. He went to find Hector. By noon, the ranch was buttoned down. Animals moved, supplies checked, the men distributed between the bunkhouse and the main house, with instructions to stay put. Eleanor moved the last of her glass medication jars to the higher shelf in the east room, out of reach of any flooding, if the snow came heavy enough to work under the door. She was doing this when May appeared breathless in the doorway. "Nora Hatch," May said. Eleanor turned. She knew that name. Nora Hatch. 32 years old, 8 months pregnant, living in a homestead 3 miles east with her husband Daniel and their 2 existing children. Eleanor had visited her twice. The baby was positioned correctly. Everything had been straightforward. "She's started," May said. "Daniel just rode in. Said it came on fast about an hour ago." Eleanor looked at the window. The sky had gone the particular flat white of a sky that has made up its mind. "How far apart?" Eleanor said. "He said every 10 minutes when he left, but that was 40 minutes ago." Eleanor was already moving. She went to her bag already packed, always packed now, because she had learned in the first week that this frontier did not give you time to assemble yourself, and she checked it in 30 seconds. Forceps. Cord ties. The clean cloths she kept folded in the bottom. The small bottle of carbolic solution. Her father's stethoscope. "I'm going," she said. May grabbed her arm. "Eleanor, it's 3 miles. The storm? She's alone out there with 2 children and a baby coming, and a husband who has never delivered anything." Eleanor looked at May steadily. "Would you stay here?" May let go of her arm. "Take Daniel. He can get you there faster." "I need him to stay calm and be useful when we arrive. Can you ride?" May blinked. "I'm 52. Can you ride?" "Well enough." "Then you're coming with me." They were out the door in 4 minutes. Rhett saw them from the yard and understood the situation in about 2 seconds. "Eleanor." He was beside her before she reached the horse. "You cannot go out in this. Look at that sky." "I'm looking at it," she said. She was checking Abigail's girth strap. 3 miles. We'll be there and inside before it breaks." "You don't know that." "No, but Nora Hatch doesn't know I'm coming, and if I don't go, she will deliver that baby with no one but her husband and God, and I have better training than either of them at the moment." "Eleanor." She turned and looked at him directly, not with anger, with absolute clarity. "Rhett, I am going. I would like your help if you're willing, but I'm going either way." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. She watched the decision move through him. Not capitulation, not defeat, but the specific recalibration of a man who has just recognized something about who he's dealing with. "All right ahead," he said. "I know the Hatch property better than you do. Stay close." He had his horse saddled in less time than she would have thought possible. They made it to the Hatch homestead in 45 minutes, the wind already building behind them, and Daniel Hatch met them at the door with the wild-eyed expression of a man who has been holding himself together through effort alone. "She's worse," he said. "A lot worse. The pains are they're coming fast now." Eleanor pushed past him without ceremony. Nora was in the back room in her bed gripping the headboard with both hands, and when Eleanor came through the door, she turned her head and said in a voice made thin by pain, but with something like a laugh underneath it, "I knew you'd come." "Of course I came," Eleanor said. "Let me see where we are." What she found was not the straightforward delivery she'd been managing in her mind on the ride over. The baby had shifted some time in the last day, the position had changed, and the labor was working against itself. Eleanor had read about this. She had studied it in 3 different texts. She had never actually managed one. She took 3 seconds to acknowledge that. Then she put it away and worked. "May," she said without turning. "I need the water boiling. Nora, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to tell you exactly what to do, and I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Nora, between contractions, looked at her with the clear-eyed desperation of a woman who has moved past the point where pride is relevant. "Yes," she said. "Good." Eleanor put her hand over Nora's on the headboard. "This is going to be hard. It is not going to be easy, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I have done this before." A slight, carefully constructed truth. Because she had done parts of this, she had read all of it, and in this moment, the distinction was something only she needed to know, and I am going to get you through it. Nora tightened her grip on Eleanor's hand. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Outside, the blizzard arrived. Eleanor heard it hit the walls of the homestead, that sudden absolute change in the sound of the world outside, the wind going from building to enormous in what felt like 60 seconds. The candles flickered. May's voice from the kitchen went tight for a moment, and then steadied. Inside the room, Eleanor had no attention to spare for the storm. The labor went on for 2 more hours. There were moments that were very bad moments when Eleanor's hands had to do things they had never done before, while her mind ran the relevant pages of her father's notes, and her surgical guide simultaneously cross-referencing, choosing, deciding. There were moments when Nora made sounds that Daniel outside the door could not bear, and Eleanor heard him weeping quietly in the hall, and noted it, and kept working. There was one moment, one specific minute about 90 minutes in, when Eleanor felt genuine fear move through her. Not panic, not paralysis, but real fear, the kind that clarifies rather than freezes. She was at a juncture, and she could feel that one decision was going to determine what happened next, and there was no one in this room more qualified than she was, and that fact was either the most frightening thing she'd ever encountered, or the most important. She decided it was important. She made the decision. She acted on it. Her hands were steady. The baby came 12 minutes later, a girl furious and loud, and the furious loudness of it was the most beautiful sound Eleanor had ever heard in her life. She got the cord tied. She checked the baby's color, her airway, her reflexes. All of it. Exactly as it should be. She wrapped the baby in the clean cloth and put her in Nora's arms. Nora looked at her daughter. Then she looked at Eleanor. She didn't say anything because there was nothing large enough to say. Eleanor looked back. She nodded once. Then she turned away so that Nora could have the moment privately, and she went about the necessary work of making sure everything was stable, because that was what you did when you had delivered someone safely. Somewhere, you made sure the ground was solid before you let yourself breathe. When she finally came out of the room, Rhett was there. He had stayed. She had not expected that. She had expected him to wait out the storm in the kitchen, or perhaps even start back when it became clear the blizzard was going to keep them overnight. Instead, he was in the hallway back against the wall, arms crossed. And when she came through the door, he straightened and looked at her face, and whatever he saw there changed his expression in a way she had not seen before. "Baby's here," she said. "Girl, both well." Daniel Hatch made a sound she would not describe later because it was too private, and he went past her into the room. She could hear him through the closed door, his voice low and completely broken open in the best way. Rhett was still looking at her. "How bad was it?" he said. "Complicated. The position had changed. I had to—" She stopped. Her hands, she realized, were shaking. They had been steady for 2.5 hours, and now in the aftermath, they were shaking. She looked at them with mild surprise. Rhett reached out and covered both of her hands with one of his. Just that. No words. Just the warm, solid weight of his hand over hers until the shaking stopped. It took about 30 seconds. He did not move or comment for any of them. When she looked up, he said, "You did that." "I did part of it. May helped. Nora did most of it. She always does. The woman doing the work always does most of it." "Eleanor." He waited until she actually met his eyes. "You did that." She held his gaze. Something was moving in her chest that she did not have a precise word for. Not pride, exactly, not relief exactly, but something that encompassed both and was larger than either. The feeling of having been exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was built to do, in a moment that mattered completely. "Yes," she said. "I did." He let go of her hands. She looked back at them, steady now. "We're here till morning," he said. "The storm isn't moving." "I know. I'll take the floor." "You're too tall for that floor," she said. "Probably." He almost smiled. "I'll manage." The blizzard held them in the Hatch homestead for 14 hours. It was not comfortable, and it was not simple, but there was a quality to those hours that Eleanor would return to later in her memory with something she could only call gratitude. May fed everyone from whatever she found in the Hatch kitchen, a competence in improvisation that Eleanor found deeply admirable. Daniel moved between his wife and newborn daughter with the stunned tenderness of a man still absorbing what had happened. The two older Hatch children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, were utterly fascinated by Eleanor in a way that manifested in them sitting as close to her as possible and asking questions at irregular intervals. "Did it hurt?" the girl asked, referring to the birth in the way of a child who has overheard more than the adults realized. "Not me," Eleanor said. "Your mother is very brave." "Are you brave?" Eleanor considered this honestly. "I'm not sure. Tonight I was necessary. That's similar but not the same." The girl thought about this. "I want to be a doctor," she said. May made a small sound from the kitchen. Rhett, from his position near the door, said nothing. But Eleanor saw something move across his face, quiet and serious, the expression of a man filing something away. She checked on Nora twice more through the night. Both times Nora was awake, once feeding the baby, once simply lying with the baby on her chest, looking at her in the dim light with the particular absorption of someone who cannot quite believe the thing they're holding. "What will you name her?" Eleanor asked the second time. Nora looked up. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We hadn't settled on anything for a girl." Another pause. "Eleanor is a good name." Eleanor stood very still for a moment. "That's your choice," she said carefully. "I know it is." Nora adjusted the baby against her chest. "I've made it." Eleanor went back to the hallway before her face could do something she hadn't authorized. They rode back in the morning through a world made entirely white and silent and new. The storm had passed with the thoroughness of something that had made a point and was satisfied. The snow was deep and the horses moved through it with effort, but the sky had cleared to a blue so sharp it looked cut out of something. Rhett rode ahead, breaking the path, and Eleanor followed, and May came behind her, making comments about her joints that were entirely justified by the circumstance. Hector was the first one they saw when they reached the ranch, standing at the gate, watching the road, and Eleanor understood from the set of his shoulders that he had been there for a while. When they rode in, he came to Abigail's side and took the bridle, which was something Eleanor had never seen him do. "Baby," he said. "Girl," Eleanor said. "Both fine." Something moved across Hector Vane's face relief, and beneath it, something else, something she hadn't seen there before. When she dismounted, he said quietly, so only she could hear, "I've been in Red Hollow 11 years. I've watched 3 women die in childbed in this valley." He stopped. 3. Eleanor met his eyes. "Not last night," she said. "No." He held her gaze. "Not last night." He handed Abigail off to one of the younger hands and walked away. Eleanor watched him go, and she understood something about this place that she hadn't fully understood before, that what she had done last night was not just a medical event. It was a statement. It was a refutation of 3 years of loss and a declaration that things here were going to be different. The ranch hands who had been moving around the yard had mostly stopped. They were watching her. Not with the studied casualness of the first day, not with the wariness of men deciding what to make of a stranger. They were watching her the way you watch someone you have placed your trust in and found that the trust held. Curtis, the man with the arm she'd treated in the first week, said from across the yard, "The baby have a name." Eleanor looked at him. Eleanor. The yard was quiet for a moment. Then, one of the youngest hands, the boy who'd asked if Abigail liked her, let out a sound that was almost a whoop, and someone else laughed, and May said from behind Eleanor, "Well, don't just stand there looking proud. Someone take my horse. I'm too old for this." It was Rhett who told her about the town meeting. He came to find her that afternoon. She was in the East Room writing up everything from the delivery in her most precise hand, because she intended to have a complete record of every case she managed, for the sake of accuracy and for the sake of any future claim that she had been practicing medicine responsibly. And he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and said, "Red Hollow wants to meet with you." Eleanor looked up. "The whole town." "Close enough. May's been talking. Word got around about last night." He paused. "And about Ruth Alderman." Eleanor set down her pen. Ruth had told Curtis 2 days ago, before Eleanor's 2-week boundary. She had done it herself on her own terms, and Curtis had come to find Eleanor afterward with red eyes and the contained, deliberate composure of a man determined to be what his wife needed. He had asked Eleanor 3 precise questions and listened to the answers without flinching, and when he left, he had shaken her hand. Just that. "What kind of meeting?" Eleanor said. "The kind where they ask you to stay," Rhett said. "Officially, formally." He met her eyes. "As Red Hollow's physician." Eleanor absorbed that. "They know I'm not licensed," she said. "They know you delivered Nora Hatch's daughter in a blizzard and walked back through 2 feet of snow the next morning and went straight to work." He paused. "That's its own kind of license out here." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about Gerald Pratt's visit. She was thinking about Vivian's petition, which Ambrose Vail was contesting in Boston at this moment. She was thinking about the specific tactical value of being formally recognized by a community, of having something on paper, something witnessed, something that said this woman belongs here, and we have chosen her. She was also thinking, with the part of her that was simply Eleanor and not strategy, that this was the first time in her life an entire community had wanted her for what she actually was. "When?" she said. "Saturday." "I'll be there." Rhett nodded. He started to go. "Rhett." He turned. "The baby's name," she said. "Nora told me last night." "I know," he said. "Daniel told me this morning." Eleanor looked at him carefully. His expression was doing that thing again, the controlled, minimal thing that was doing more than it appeared to. "I didn't ask her to do that," Eleanor said. "I know you didn't. I want to be clear about that." "Eleanor." He held her gaze. "I know exactly who you are. I've been watching for 5 weeks." He put his hat back on. "That's why I know." He left. Eleanor sat for a long moment with her pen in her hand and the page in front of her unwritten. Then she wrote the baby's name at the top of the delivery record. Eleanor Hatch, born March 29, 1875. Red Hollow, Colorado. Delivered by Eleanor Blackthorne. She looked at those two names together on the page. The same name, one newborn, and one finally beginning to understand what she was, both alive in this valley that had almost not existed for either of them. She kept writing until the light changed, and May called her for supper, and she ate with Rhett and the hands, and listened to them talk about the snow and the cattle, and Pip's knee, which was improving on schedule. And she sat in the middle of all of it without the feeling of being apart from it, that had defined every meal, every room, every conversation of her entire previous life. She was inside something, not observing from its edges. She did not remark on this. She only held it quietly, the way you hold something you don't want to disturb until you're sure it's real. It was real. She was almost certain now. It was real. The Saturday meeting was held in May's boarding house because it was the largest indoor space in Red Hollow, and by the time Eleanor arrived, every seat was taken and people were standing 3 deep along the walls. She had not expected that. She stopped in the doorway for one unguarded second, and in that second she took in the faces, the ranch hands, the homestead families, women she had treated, and women she hadn't yet. Men who had watched her arrive 6 weeks ago with varying degrees of skepticism, and were now watching her arrive with something different entirely. Daniel and Nora Hatch were in the front row, Nora pale and careful still from the delivery, but upright, with the baby wrapped against her chest. Nora caught Eleanor's eye and nodded once, the nod of a woman communicating something that did not require words. May was at the front of the room. She had set up a chair there, a single chair facing everyone else, and she gestured at it now with the authority of a woman who has decided how this meeting is going to go. Eleanor sat. The room went quiet. May said, "I'll make this plain because that's the only way I know how to make anything. Red Hollow has needed a doctor for 5 months. What we've had instead is Eleanor Blackthorne, which has turned out to be considerably better." She looked around the room. "We're here to ask her formally to stay, as our physician, paid, housed, and recognized." She looked at Eleanor. "We've taken a collection. It's not Boston money, but it's what we have." Eleanor looked at the envelope May was holding. She looked at the room full of people who had come out in early April weather to sit in a crowded building and make a formal declaration about her place among them. She had prepared something to say. She had written it out the night before and revised it twice. She had intended to be measured and professional and clear about the terms and limitations of her position. Instead, she said, "I'm staying. I was always going to stay. But thank you for asking." The room exhaled. Someone in the back started clapping, and it spread fast, the way things spread in small places where everyone has been waiting for the same thing. Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds to feel it completely, the full, unguarded weight of being wanted. Then she composed herself and looked up because there was business to discuss, and she was not a woman who let sentiment interfere with structure. The practical arrangements took another hour. Eleanor had conditions. She stated them clearly without apology. She required a proper space. The East Room at the ranch had worked, but she needed a dedicated building closer to the center of the settlement, somewhere families could reach her without a 2-mile ride. She required a regular supply order through Glenville for medications and instruments. She required that her cases be considered private, unless disclosure was medically necessary, the same standard she applied now, which meant the community trusted her judgment on patient confidentiality. Every condition was met without argument. Rhett, sitting at the back of the room with Hector beside him, said nothing during the meeting. He had not arranged it, that had been. May Eleanor understood May and Nora Hatch and Lenora Graves and Curtis Alderman, and a coalition of practical people who had decided something collectively and moved on it. Rhett had simply come the way he came to everything that mattered in Red Hollow, quietly and without ceremony, because his presence was a statement of support whether or not he spoke. When it was over, and the room was dispersing into smaller conversations, he came to find her. "Building," he said. "East edge of the main street. The Perkins family owns it, Old Doc's place. They've been wanting to sell. I can negotiate it. Eleanor looked at him. How long have you been thinking about this? Since the blizzard. That was a week ago. I think fast when I need to, he said. She studied him for a moment. There was something she had been meaning to address for several days. A conversation she had been putting off, not from avoidance, but from the need to have it precisely without ambiguity, on a day when she had the clarity to do it well. Rhett, she said, I need to talk to you about the arrangement. He waited. We've been operating on a framework, she said. The one you described when I arrived, practical, fair, revisable. I want to revise it. Something went still in his face. He was watching her very carefully now. I don't want a framework, Eleanor said. I want a marriage, a real one. She kept her gaze level and her voice even, because this was not a romantic speech, and she was not delivering it as one. It was a statement of position, and she needed him to understand the difference. Not because of the trust, not because of Vivian's petition. Those things are real, but they're not why I'm saying this. She paused. I'm saying this because for the first time in my life, I am somewhere I chose doing work I was built for with a person She stopped, collected herself. With a person I respect more than anyone I've known, and I would like it to be permanent. Rhett was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, You're proposing to me. I am. In May's boarding house. Yes. He looked around the room, most of it still occupied by people talking in small clusters, none of whom were paying them direct attention. I was going to ask you, he said. Eleanor raised her eyebrows. When? I was working up to it. How long would that have taken? Longer than this, he admitted. Something shifted in his face that controlled expression, breaking just briefly into something warmer and more unguarded than she had seen from him before. Yes, Eleanor, the answer is yes. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without flourish. It was yes before you asked. She looked at him. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. They stood together in the middle of May's boarding house, with the noise of Red Hollow around them, and it was not romantic in any conventional sense. No candlelight, no flowers, no architecture of sentiment, but it was entirely, perfectly, absolutely them, and Eleanor found she would not have adjusted a single thing about it. Yek, the letter from Vivian arrived the following Tuesday, and it was not alone. It came with a second letter, this one from Gerald Pratt, and a third from a different Boston law firm that Eleanor didn't recognize, a firm with 3 names on the letterhead that she subsequently learned was one of the most expensive in Massachusetts. She read all 3 before she spoke to anyone. Vivian had escalated. The petition to dissolve the trust had added new claims that Eleanor was practicing medicine illegally and in a manner damaging to the Blackthorne family reputation, that the mail-order arrangement constituted evidence of moral instability, and that Eleanor's failure to return to Boston after receiving Pratt's letter demonstrated willful defiance of family authority and legal process. The third letter from the new firm was nastier. It cited Eleanor by name in language designed to wound an unmarried woman of diminished social standing, operating without license or legitimate credential, in conditions unsuitable for any person of good character. It suggested that the Colorado court should consider Eleanor's activities as evidence of unsound judgment. Eleanor set all 3 letters on her desk in the treatment room. She laid them in a neat row. She looked at them for a moment. Then she went to find Ambrose Vale's last letter, which she kept in the left drawer, and she read it again. Vale's most recent update was 3 weeks old, but it had contained something useful, a name. Judge Cyrus Aldgate, who oversaw estates in Massachusetts, and who had, according to Vale, a particular dislike for petitions that smelled of opportunism dressed as legal procedure. She wrote to Vale immediately. She told him about the new firm. She told him about the community meeting and its outcome, and she suggested he obtain a formal record of it, name signatures the terms offered. She told him about the baby. She paused at that last item. Then she included it anyway. A child has been named for me in this community. I mention this not for sentiment, but because it is evidence of the standing I hold here which is the standing of a person who is needed and trusted and recognized, which is more than can be said for my position in Boston at any point in my adult life." She sealed the letter. She addressed it to Glenville for the weekly mail run. Then she walked to Rhett's office and put Vivian's letters on his desk. He read them without comment. When he finished, he looked up. "The new firm," he said. "Expensive," Eleanor said. "She's spending real money now." "Which means she thinks there's real money to win. The trust is not inconsiderable. My father was careful with money." Eleanor sat down across from him. "She waited until she thought I was gone and forgotten. Now she knows I'm not, and she's trying to move fast before I establish enough ground to stand on." "You already have ground," Rhett said. "I need more of it." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "The marriage should happen soon. Not because it changes everything, Vale thinks the trust can be defended regardless, but because it changes the arithmetic. A married woman in an established community with a formal position is considerably harder to characterize as morally unstable." Rhett's expression shifted. "I don't want to marry you for arithmetic." "Neither do I," Eleanor said. "I want to marry you because I told you exactly why 5 days ago, and I meant every word. But wanting something and using it practically are not mutually exclusive, and I would rather be honest with you about both." He held her gaze. "End of the month," he said. "That works," she said. She stood to go. "He said, Eleanor." She turned. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read, the one that was saying more than his face was fully showing. "The letters," he said. "They wrote those things about you." "Yes." "Diminished social standing." His jaw was tight. "Unsuitable conditions." "Rhett, I read what they said about you." His voice was even, but underneath it was something that was not entirely even. "I want you to know that when I look at what you've built here in 6 weeks, the patience you've treated the baby, you delivered the way this town voted on Saturday." He stopped. "There is nothing diminished about you. There never was." Eleanor stood in the doorway. Something moved through her, not the careful, strategic calm she'd been maintaining since the letters arrived, but something underneath that raw and real and old. The specific ache of a woman who has been told she is insufficient by people who had power over her, and who has carried that verdict for so long, that hearing it refuted still catches her off guard. She didn't cry, but her throat did something that required a moment to manage. "Thank you," she said. The roughness was back in her voice, the same roughness as the train station in Denver when Addie Sorrells had been kind to her. "It's just true," Rhett said. "I know." She paused. "Sometimes the true things are the ones that are hardest to hear." She went back to work. Ruth Alderman was getting worse, and Eleanor had known it for 2 weeks. The sounds in Ruth's lungs had changed, not dramatically, but in the specific incremental way that Eleanor had been reading about in her father's notes and did not like the direction of. She had adjusted the treatment twice. She had insisted on rest in a way that required Curtis to essentially restructure the household to keep Ruth from overdoing it, which Curtis did without a single complaint, and with the particular focused determination of a man who has decided that this is the most important project of his life. Ruth herself was the harder problem. She came to Eleanor's treatment room on a Thursday, the Perkins building which Rhett had negotiated, and which Eleanor had converted with the help of May and 3 ranch wives, into something that actually resembled a clinic, and she sat in the chair beside the examination table and said, "Tell me true." Eleanor looked at her. "I'm not Nora Hatch," Ruth said. "I'm not looking for you to hold my hand. I want the truth of where this is going." Eleanor sat across from her. She thought about her father's habit. His insistence on giving patients real information because dignity required it. She thought about how she would want to be told, "The treatment is helping," Eleanor said. "I believe that. The progression has slowed. But I will not tell you it stopped because I don't know that, and you asked me for truth." She paused. "What I can tell you is this: I am watching you closely. I am adjusting what I'm doing based on what I see, and I am not going to stop, ever." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Curtis cried. I know. He thinks I don't hear him at night." She looked at her hands. "I hear him." Eleanor said nothing. Sometimes the right response to something like that was just to sit with it. "He's not a man who cries easily," Ruth said. "In 20 years I've seen it twice. Once when our boy was born. Once when—" She stopped. "He loves me more than I sometimes know what to do with." "That's not a small thing," Eleanor said quietly. "No." Ruth looked up. "I want more time, Eleanor. I'm not asking for miracles. I'm just telling you what I want." "Then that's what we're working toward," Eleanor said. "More time." Ruth nodded. She stood. At the door she stopped and looked back. "You should know," she said. "Curtis talks about you the way he talks about people he'd follow into a fight. That's the highest thing he says about anyone." Eleanor let that settle. "Tell him the feeling is mutual," she said. The second twist came not from Boston, but from within Red Hollow itself, and Eleanor did not see it coming. His name was Aldous Fearing, and he arrived in town on a Wednesday with a land survey document and a claim that approximately 40 acres of the Eastern Valley, including the homesteads of 3 families Eleanor had treated, including the Hatches, had been sold to a Denver investment consortium 18 months ago by a previous territorial land agent, and that the current occupants were therefore squatters on private commercial land. Eleanor heard about it from May, who heard it from Hector, who had been in the general store when Fearing made his announcement. She went directly to find Rhett. He already knew. He was in his office with the survey document, or rather a copy of it that Hector had somehow obtained in the hours since Fearing's arrival, and his expression when Eleanor came in was controlled in the specific way of a man managing something that is making him very angry. "Legal?" Eleanor asked. "Possibly," Rhett said. "The survey looks real. The land agent man named Carver left the territory 14 months ago. Nobody can find him." "Which is convenient." "Very." He set the document down. "Fearing's with the consortium. He's not the principal, he's a representative. Clean hands, official papers, polished shoes." He looked up. "The Hatch family. The Graves family. The Dunns. That's 3 families I know personally. Between them, 7 children." Eleanor looked at the document. She looked at it the way she looked at things she intended to understand completely. "Ambrose Vale," she said. "I was thinking the same. This is the kind of work he does." She reached across the desk and picked up the survey. She turned it over. She looked at the registration marks, the date stamps, the signature of the land agent named Carver. "Rhett, this signature." He leaned over. "What about it?" "The ink is wrong." She held it toward the light. "Look at the Carver signature versus the witness signature beside it. The witness ink has oxidized differently. It's older. The Carver signature is newer. Someone signed this after the fact." Rhett looked at her. "You can see that," he said. "My father had me study documents when I was 12. He said a physician needs to recognize forgeries because some patients falsify their histories." She set the document down. "This has been backdated. Carver may never have signed it at all." The room was very quiet. "If you're right," Rhett said slowly, "this isn't a land dispute. This is fraud." "Yes. And if Fearing is here with a fraudulent document, then someone sent him here knowing it was fraudulent, hoping the families involved don't have the resources or the knowledge to contest it." Eleanor looked at him. "Which is exactly the kind of operation that works in places that don't have legal representation." Rhett stood. "I'll write to Vale tonight." "I already drafted the letter," Eleanor said. She took it from her coat pocket. "I wrote it while you were reading the document." He looked at the folded paper in her hand. Something crossed his face, that expression she had almost stopped trying to decode because it was so specifically his, and she was still learning its full vocabulary. "You were already 3 steps ahead," he said. "I'm a physician," she said. "I was trained to think about what happens next." He took the letter. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the practical transaction of taking a piece of paper. "Eleanor?" he said. "We should move fast," she said. "Fearing will be presenting this to the territorial office in Glenville. We have maybe a week before it becomes official record." "I know." He held her gaze. "But Eleanor, I was going to ask you something else." She waited. "The end of the month," he said. "For the wedding." He paused. "Would sooner be agreeable." Eleanor looked at him. She understood that he was not asking for the arithmetic reasons they'd already discussed those. He was asking because of Fearing's arrival, because of the document, because of the specific knowledge that the ground under this valley was less stable than it had looked yesterday morning, and he wanted something solid and real and unassailable between them before the next thing arrived. She understood that. She felt it herself. "Saturday," she said. "If May can arrange it." "May will arrange it in 4 hours," Rhett said. "You don't know what she's like when she has a project." "I'm beginning to," Eleanor said. She went to find May. The wedding was small and true, and exactly sufficient. May arranged everything in 3 hours as predicted. The community's justice of the peace, a taciturn man named Hobbs, who did this about twice a year, and had the ceremony memorized to a single streamlined version, conducted it in the front room of the Callahan ranch house, with May and Hector as witnesses. And most of Red Hollow crowded outside the windows, in a way that was technically not invited, but also not unwelcome. Eleanor wore her good wool dress, not the wedding gown she did not own, and had never expected to own, but the deep blue dress that was her best, that she had worn to her father's funeral, and to her first meeting with Gerald Pratt, that had been with her through every significant thing. Rhett looked at her when she came into the room, the way a man looks at something he has been afraid might not be real and has just confirmed is. The ceremony took 11 minutes. When Hobbs said the final words and it was done, Rhett took her hand, and the outside windows erupted with the sound of Red Hollow being pleased with itself, and May wept with the thoroughness of a woman who had been holding it in for weeks. Eleanor stood in the middle of it and felt the specific, enormous simplicity of belonging to somewhere, to someone, to a life that was hers. She held Rhett's hand and she did not let go. Outside the window, Curtis Alderman was hollering something she couldn't quite make out. Hector Vane was shaking his head with the expression of a man who has accidentally become fond of things he'd been determined not to be fond of. Pip's knee was almost healed, and he was standing on it when he probably shouldn't have been. But she was a physician and not his mother, and there was a limit to what she could enforce on a celebration. Rhett leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "Aldous Fearing is still in town." "I know," she said. "Vale's letter should reach Glenville by Friday." "I know that too." "So it's not over?" "No," Eleanor said. She looked at him. "But we're better positioned than we were this morning." She paused. "And considerably better positioned than we were in March." He looked back at her. "You walked off a train platform 6 weeks ago with one suitcase and a bag of medical books." "And my father's stethoscope," she said. "Don't forget the stethoscope." "And in 6 weeks, we're not done yet," she said. "Don't summarize a story before the last chapter." He almost laughed. It was the closest she had seen him come to a full, unguarded laugh. And it was the best thing she had seen all day, which was a day that had contained considerable competition. "All right," he said. "What's next?" Eleanor looked toward the window, toward Fearing's direction, toward Glenville, toward Boston, toward all of it. "We finish it," she said. Ambrose Vale arrived in Red Hollow on a Thursday morning, and he was not alone. Eleanor had expected a letter. She had not expected the man himself, compact, sharp-eyed, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a traveling coat that had seen considerable use, and a leather case that looked like it had survived a war. He came off the Glenville stage and walked directly to the clinic on the east edge of Main Street, as though he had the address memorized, which he did because Eleanor had drawn him a map in her last letter. She was with a patient when he arrived. May intercepted him, which was May's particular gift, the ability to manage unexpected arrivals without drama and without letting them feel managed. By the time Eleanor finished and came out, Vale was drinking coffee at May's table and had apparently already obtained a complete summary of the Fearing situation from May herself. "You didn't need to come in person," Eleanor said, shaking his hand. "I did," Vale said. "Sit down." She sat. His tone was not alarming exactly, but it had the quality of a man carrying information he has organized carefully and intends to deliver precisely. "The trust petition first," he said. "Judge Aldgate ruled last week. The petition is denied." He opened his case and slid a document across the table. "Dismissed on 3 grounds: the forged signature on the original mail-order correspondence, the absence of any voluntary renunciation on your part, and—" He paused with something that was not quite a smile. "And a sworn affidavit from a Mrs. Adelaide Sorrells of Denver, who testified that she traveled with you on the train from Boston, and that you were in full possession of your faculties, your intentions, and your father's medical library, and were proceeding west by your own considered decision." Eleanor stared at him. "Addie Sorrells." "She came forward voluntarily," Vale said. "Apparently you made an impression." Eleanor looked at the ruling in her hands. She read it through completely because she read everything completely, and the language was unambiguous. Vivian's petition was dead. The trust provision stood. Her father's intentions were legally upheld. She set the document down on the table. She thought about her father in his study, writing the trust with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything. She thought about him at 57, already sick, and knowing it, making sure she would be provided for. She thought about how furious he would have been if he had known what Vivian tried to do with his careful work. "Thank you," she said to Vale. Her voice was steady. "Thank Mrs. Sorrells," he said. "I just filed the paperwork." "Now," Vale said, "Aldous Fearing." He opened his case again, and this time spread 3 documents on the table. Eleanor leaned forward. "The Carver signature," she began, "is fraudulent," Vale confirmed. "You were right. I had a document examiner in Denver look at it. The ink analysis is conclusive. The Carver signature was applied at least 8 months after the document's stated date. Carver himself." Vale paused. "Carver himself is dead. He died of pneumonia in Santa Fe 11 months ago." Eleanor absorbed that. "So he couldn't have signed anything recently?" "No, which means someone else signed his name on a land survey document, which is forgery, which is a federal crime when it involves territorial land claims." Vale tapped the 3rd document. "The Denver consortium behind Fearing. I've been running that string for 2 weeks. The principal investor is a man named Howard Gill. He's done this before twice in New Mexico territory. Different land agent names, same method: find a deceased or departed agent, forge his survey move on a settlement before anyone can organize a defense." He looked at Eleanor. "They picked Red Hollow because it was small and because they didn't expect anyone here to know what they were looking at." "They didn't know about Eleanor," May said from the other side of the table. Vale looked at Eleanor with the particular expression of a man updating his assessment. "No," he said. "They clearly did not." "What happens to Fearing?" Eleanor asked. "He'll be arrested. The federal marshal out of Denver has been notified. He should arrive within the week." Vale closed his case. "The homesteads are safe. Hatch graves done, all of them. The fraudulent claim is void." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about Nora Hatch, 8 days out from delivery, sitting in the front row of the community meeting with baby Eleanor against her chest. She was thinking about Lenora Graves and her daughter, who had said she wanted to be a doctor. She was thinking about 3 families who had built their lives on this ground and had almost had it taken by men who had calculated that no one here was equipped to stop them. They had calculated wrong. "I need to tell the families," Eleanor said. She was already standing. "I thought you might," Vale said. He picked up his coffee. "I'll be here when you get back. We have some additional paperwork regarding your formal establishment as a medical practitioner in this territory. There's a provision under territorial law for licensed practice in underserved settlements, and I've begun the application on your behalf." Eleanor stopped. She turned. "A formal license. Conditional pending review, but yes." He met her eyes. "You've been practicing medicine in Red Hollow for 7 weeks. You have documented cases, patient records, I assume, and the formal endorsement of the community." The Territorial Board does not have a provision for women, not explicitly, but it also does not explicitly exclude them, and I intend to argue that the absence of exclusion is the same as permission in a settlement that has no other qualified practitioner. He paused. It will not be immediate. It may be contested, but I believe we can win it. Eleanor stood in the doorway of May's kitchen, with the ruling in her hand and a formal license application pending in Denver, and a community of people whose land had just been saved, and she let herself feel just for one full deliberate moment the full scope of what had been built in 7 weeks from a one-way train ticket and one suitcase. Then she went to tell the Hatch family. Rhett was with Daniel Hatch when Eleanor arrived, which did not surprise her. Rhett had a habit of being where things were happening before they were announced. Some combination of instinct and network she had stopped questioning and started relying on. She told them directly. The claim was fraudulent. The land was theirs. The man responsible would be arrested. Daniel Hatch sat down on his own porch steps with the abruptness of a man whose legs have decided the emergency is over. Nora, holding the baby, looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "You knew," she said. "When Fearing first arrived, you already suspected." "I suspected the document," Eleanor said. "I didn't know about Jill or the pattern until Vale confirmed it." "But you moved immediately." "I wrote the letter the same day." Nora shifted the baby to one arm and reached out and gripped Eleanor's wrist briefly and hard. "Eleanor Hatch," she said. It took Eleanor a moment to understand what she meant, that the baby's name was also a statement of position, that it had been from the beginning. "She'll grow up on land that's actually hers," Eleanor said. "Because of you," Nora said. Eleanor shook her head. "Because you all built something worth defending. I just knew what the document looked like." Rhett, standing to the side, said nothing. But when Eleanor glanced at him, he was watching her with that expression, the one that was saying things he would say later in private, where they had the space to say them properly. Aldous. Fearing left Red Hollow on Friday, escorted by 2 men who arrived from Glenville with official papers and expressions that discouraged conversation. Eleanor watched from the clinic doorway. Fearing passed without looking at her. He was a man who had arrived with the confidence of someone operating a scheme that had worked before, and he was leaving with nothing, and Eleanor noted this without satisfaction and without regret. He was a problem that had been solved. She had other problems to attend to. The territorial license application was the most pressing. Vale had left her with the paperwork and clear instructions. What he needed from her was documentation. Her case records, her father's credentials that established her training lineage. The community endorsement letter that she now needed to have formally signed by every household in the valley, and a written account of her practice since arriving. She spent the weekend writing. She wrote the account of her practice, the way she wrote her case notes, precisely without embellishment, with every relevant fact in its place. She listed every patient she had treated, every procedure she had performed, every outcome. She included the delivery of Eleanor Hatch in full clinical detail. She included Ruth Alderman's case with careful language about the ongoing management and the reasoning behind each treatment adjustment. She included the fact that she had treated 31 patients in 7 weeks in a settlement that had had no medical care for 5 months and that not one of them had died under her care. She wrote that last line, and then she read it back to herself. 31 patients, not one death. She had not tallied it before. She had been too busy living inside each individual case to step back and see the full count. Looking at it now, laid out in her own handwriting on paper that would go to the Territorial Board in Denver, she felt something move through her that was larger than she had room for at that moment. She set the pen down. She gave herself 2 minutes. Then she picked it up and kept writing. It was May who noticed Ruth Alderman first. She came to Eleanor on a Monday morning with that particular quality of worry that May wore differently from her usual energy, tight or lower. "Ruth had a bad night," May said. "Curtis sent word." Eleanor was already reaching for her bag. She rode to the Alderman homestead in 20 minutes. Curtis met her at the door with the face of a man who has been awake all night managing his own fear so it doesn't become a burden on the person who needs him. "Fever," he said. "Started around midnight. She wouldn't let me come for you until this morning because she said you needed sleep." Eleanor went in. She examined Ruth with everything she had. Every piece of knowledge from every text she had ever read. Every observation from 7 weeks of watching this particular patient. The fever was real, and it was significant. The sounds in the lungs had changed again. Ruth was watching her from the bed with those clear, direct eyes that never looked away from the truth. "Tell me," Ruth said. Eleanor sat in the chair beside the bed. She leaned forward and put her forearms on her knees because this was not a conversation for professional distance. "This is a setback," she said. "Not the end, but it's serious, and I'm not going to tell you otherwise." She paused. "I'm going to change the treatment. I've been reading about a protocol that I think gives you a better chance. It requires rest, complete rest. Ruth, not the version of rest where you think you're resting, and then you do 3 things that aren't rest." Ruth almost smiled. "Curtis will enforce it. Curtis will be grateful to have clear instructions." Eleanor met her eyes. "I need you to fight Ruth. I know you're tired. I know this is hard, but I need you to choose to fight." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I hear little Eleanor Hatch crying sometimes when the wind is right. From the Hatch place." Eleanor waited. "I want to hear that child grow up," Ruth said. "I want to hear what she sounds like when she's 5 and 10. Her jaw set. "That's my reason. That's plenty." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." She stayed for 3 hours. She adjusted the treatment. She wrote out the full protocol for Curtis in terms that left nothing to interpretation, and Curtis read it with the focused total attention of a man for whom this document was the most important thing in the world. When she left, he walked her to her horse. He stood with his hand on Abigail's bridle, and he said, "You're not going to give up on her." "No," Eleanor said. "Even if—" He stopped. "No," Eleanor said again more firmly. "I don't give up on patients, Curtis. That's not something I do." He nodded once. He let go of the bridle. She rode back to Red Hollow in the morning cold, with the protocol running through her mind, looking for adjustments, looking for anything she might have missed. She was still thinking about it when she got back and found Rhett waiting at the clinic door. "Vale sent a wire from Glenville," Rhett said. He handed her the paper. She read it. The territorial board had received her application. They had set a hearing date. 6 weeks. "Denver," she said. "Denver," Rhett confirmed. She folded the wire. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to prepare for a hearing before a board that had never licensed a woman and was going to be asked to do it anyway. "All right," she said. "I'll need to prepare testimony. Vale will be there." "I'll testify myself," she said. "Vale can handle the legal argument. I'll handle the medical one." She looked at Rhett. "I know my cases better than anyone. I know what I've done and why it worked and what it means for this settlement if they say no." She paused. "They need to hear it from me." Rhett looked at her for a moment. "You walked into a room full of Boston lawyers once," he said, "in Gerald Pratt." "I did." "And you walked out better than when you went in." "I did." He nodded slowly. "Then Denver doesn't stand a chance." It was the most confident thing he had ever said about her on her behalf, and it landed exactly as he intended, not as flattery, but as an honest assessment from a man who did not offer assessments lightly. "We'll see," she said, but she believed it. The 6 weeks between the wire and the Denver hearing were the most fully occupied of Eleanor's life, which was saying something considerable given the 7 weeks that had preceded them. She treated patients every day. She continued Ruth's new protocol and watched with cautious, careful attention as the fever broke at the end of the first week, and Ruth's lungs over the following weeks began to sound incrementally better, not cured, not finished, but better, moving in the right direction, which was the only direction Eleanor was interested in. Ruth Alderman was fighting. Eleanor could hear it. She trained 2 women. This had been in her mind for a while. The knowledge that one physician for 60 families spread across 20 miles was not sufficient, that she needed people who could handle basic care and recognize when to send for her. She chose May, who already knew more than she admitted, and a young woman named Iris Dunn, 19 years old, the eldest Dunn daughter, who had been coming to the clinic for 3 weeks with the thinly disguised purpose of watching everything Eleanor did and asking questions that revealed an organized, precise mind. Eleanor called Iris in one morning and said, "You want to learn." Iris blinked. "I've been trying not to be obvious about it." "You haven't succeeded," Eleanor said. "Come at 8 tomorrow. Bring something to write with." The look on Iris Dunn's face was something Eleanor recognized from the inside, the specific, enormous relief of being seen accurately for the first time. She wrote her testimony for Denver in the evenings after patients, after dinner, after the clinic was closed. She wrote it and rewrote it and made Rhett listen to it twice and made Vale read it in a letter and incorporated his suggestions and ignored the ones she disagreed with and told him why. She knew her case. She knew it cold. The Denver hearing was on a Tuesday in June, 8 months after Eleanor had boarded a train in Boston with one suitcase and her father's stethoscope. The board was 5 men. They were not unkind. 2 of them were openly skeptical. 1 was neutral, 1 was curious, and the 5th had the expression of a man who had already made up his mind and was waiting to see if the proceedings changed it. Vale gave the legal argument first. He was good, precise, and forceful, and absolutely clear on the territorial provision that permitted licensing in underserved settlements, and on the absence of any explicit prohibition on women. Then Eleanor stood. She had 31 cases. She knew everyone by name, by circumstance, by outcome. She did not read from notes. She had memorized the testimony, because she wanted to look at these 5 men while she spoke, wanted them to see her face and understand that she was not an abstraction, or a precedent, or a legal provision. She was a physician who had spent 8 months keeping people alive in a valley that had buried 3 women in childbed before she arrived. She told them about the blizzard, about Nora Hatch, and the shifted position, and the decision she'd had to make with her hands in the cold, and the sound of the storm against the walls. She told them about baby Eleanor, and she did not apologize for the name, because it was relevant evidence of community standing, and she was not a woman who apologized for relevant evidence. She told them about Ruth Alderman carefully, and with Ruth's permission, which Ruth had given in writing. She told them about the protocol change, about the fever breaking, about what it meant to manage a progressive illness in a community without a physician, the difference between catching something early and receiving someone already at the last stage. She told them about Iris Dunn, 19 years old, who was learning to recognize the sounds of a healthy lung versus a compromised one, who would be able to serve the valley in 10 years when Eleanor could not be in 2 places at once. She told them about the fraudulent land survey and said plainly that she had identified the document irregularities because her father had taught her to read carefully and think precisely, which were the same skills she applied to medicine, and that these skills were not diminished by the fact that she was a woman. The board member who had already made up his mind was watching her with the expression she had been watching for the expression that told her his mind had been made up in her favor. She closed her testimony with her father. "My father was a physician for 30 years in Boston," she said. "He taught me everything I know. He believed, and I have come to believe through practice and not merely inheritance, that medicine is not a matter of credential. It is a matter of knowledge applied with precision and care in service of people who need it. Red Hollow needed it. I provided it. 31 patients, not 1 death." She paused. "The board may decide that my sex is more significant than those 31 people. That is the board's authority to decide, but I want you to understand clearly what that decision would mean, not in the abstract, but in a specific valley in Colorado for specific people whose names I have given you, who are alive and housed and healthy, because I was there." Another pause. "And I want you to understand that I will continue to practice medicine in Red Hollow regardless of this board's decision, because those people need a physician, and I am what they have, and I am very good at this. The license would simply allow me to do it without apology." The room was quiet. The fifth board member, the one who had seemed to already know, said, "No further questions from me." Vale came out of the hearing room 40 minutes after Eleanor did, and his face told her before he spoke. "Conditional license," he said. "Annual review for 3 years, then permanent. The condition is that you file case records quarterly with the territorial board." He paused. "Unanimous." Eleanor stood in the hallway of the Denver Territorial Building and breathed. Unanimous. Not 4-1, not 3-2. 5 men, none of whom had ever done this before. All 5 looking at 31 cases, and a testimony delivered without notes, and a valley that needed what she was, and all 5 saying yes. She thought about Vivian's letter. Unsuitable conditions. Diminished social standing. She thought about the boarding house station in Boston. Colorado. One way. She thought about her father's hand over hers in his study, showing her which way to hold the stethoscope. She thought about Rhett's hand over hers in the Hatch homestead hallway holding the shaking steady. Vale was saying something about the quarterly filings, about the timeline for the permanent review, about next steps. She heard him, and she processed it, and she would remember it all later. But right now, she was doing the thing she almost never let herself do. She was standing completely inside the moment, without managing it, without looking ahead, without the constant forward calculation that had kept her alive and moving since she was 4 years old. Just this. Just here. "Eleanor," Vale said gently. She looked at him. "You have a train back to Glenville in 2 hours," he said. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." Rhett met her at the Red Hollow station. She had not told him to come. She had sent a wire with the result from Denver, a single line unanimous. Home Thursday. He had simply decided to be there, which was entirely consistent with who he was, and when she stepped off the platform and saw him, she felt something settle in her chest that she had not realized was still unsettled. He looked at her face. He said, "Unanimous." "Unanimous," she said. He didn't whoop. He didn't make a speech. He reached out and took her bag from her hand, and then he stood there looking at her with the full, unguarded expression that she had been learning for 8 months, and still found surprising in its depth. "Your father would have," he started. "Yes," she said. "He would have." They stood on the platform for a moment, and the mountains were there, and the valley was there, and Red Hollow was there. 60 families spread across 20 miles of ground that was now legally, unambiguously theirs. "Ruth is better this week," he said. "I know. Iris sent a note. Pip's knee is completely healed. He's back on full duty." I told him he would be. Baby Eleanor smiled for the first time on Tuesday. "Nora wanted you to know." Eleanor looked at him. He had been gathering these things for her, collecting them while she was gone, knowing she would want them the moment she returned, because he understood that her work was not separate from her life, but the whole center of it, and that good news from the valley was the thing she ran toward. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. For standing on a train platform. For everything that comes before and after the train platform," she said. He took her hand. They walked off the platform together and back into Red Hollow, and the town moved around them the way a place moves when you are part of it, and not a visitor in it, not making space for you because you are a stranger, but simply continuing around you because you are known. May appeared from the boarding house and said, "She's back unanimous, I made dinner, don't argue," and ushered them both inside before Eleanor could formulate a response. Hector Vane at the fence gave her a single nod that communicated everything he had learned to say without words over these 8 months. Curtis Alderman, crossing the street, stopped and said, "Ruth says she's cooking Sunday dinner and she expects you there," which meant Ruth was well enough to make plans, which meant more than anything else could have. Iris Dunn was at the clinic door with the patient waiting and her notebook already open, because Iris Dunn had understood from the first day that medicine did not pause for occasion. Eleanor looked at it all. The building she had converted from a storage room into a place where people came when they were frightened. The valley that stretched east and west with its homesteads and its families and its children who were going to grow up on land that was theirs. The husband walking beside her, who had offered her a fair deal and an honest hand and had turned out against every reasonable expectation she had arrived with to be the person she trusted most in the world. She had come here with one suitcase, her father's stethoscope, and the last desperate willingness to try. She had built a life. Not the life that had been arranged for her, not the diminished existence Boston had decided she deserved, not the cautious half-thing she might have settled for if she had stayed and absorbed what Vivian intended to teach her about her own worth. A real life chosen, constructed, defended, and fully, finally, irrevocably hers. Eleanor Callahan. She had kept Blackthorne too. Both names because she was her father's daughter, and she was Rhett's wife, and she was not willing to surrender. Either walked through the door of her clinic, took her bag from Rhett's hand, and went to see her patient. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was built for, in a place that had chosen her as clearly as she had chosen it. The woman who had been shipped west as a joke had become the one thing no one in that Boston dining room had thought to account for indispensable, rooted, and utterly magnificently unremovable. This was her valley. This was her work. This was her life. And she had earned every inch of it.